Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us in another SSC Seminar Series. Today we are pleased to have Dr. Vanessa Teague, CEO of Thinking Cybersecurity, Chairperson of Democracy Developers, and Associate Professor at ANU. Dr. Vanessa Teague's research focused primarily on cryptographic methods for achieving security and privacy, particularly for issues of public interest, such as election integrity and the protection of government data. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining us today. So I'm passing you the mic for you.
Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so my topic today is about election verification. And some of you may have seen a fair bit of the material before, although there are some new bits at some parts of it. So questions are welcome throughout. It's a bit of a smorgasbord of different things to talk about. And of course, different parts of it are relevant to people who care about democracies in different places. All right. Hi, Ron. So Ron has been warned that he's heard this talk 3 times already. All right, so the core technical part of this work is about analysing instant runoff elections, and that is joint work with Michelle Blom and Peter Stuckey. Michelle's at the University of Melbourne, Peter Stuckey is now here at Monash. But then a lot of the rest of the work about auditing more generally is joint work with this much longer list of people here on the slide. Okay, so why do we care about election evidence? Well, there we go. Many democracies are having, including the United States, and this is Brazil on the right, have serious problems with distrust in election results. We could ask why people don't trust elections, or we could kind of turn it the other way around and say, well, why should people trust elections? What positive evidence do we give to people, or how do we design the process to give them positive evidence that the election outcome actually is right? And would that help? So, I don't know. To be honest, I've just been in the United States. I'm not sure how optimistic I am that this or worse isn't going to happen again, but since we're geeks, we might as well think about the technological aspects of how to build a trustworthy technology. And if that doesn't persuade people, well, at least we did our part of the design. So this is a daggy picture from the Australian Electoral Commission. This is what election night still actually looks like in Australia. The 2 people at the front are counting ballot papers. You can see them putting House of Representative ballots into different piles. And the 4 people in the back are scrutineering the process. So they're literally kind of leaning over the people doing the counting and watching them to check that they're putting the right ballots into the right piles. So this is actually a very good process. It not only helps to get the count right and remove accidental mistakes, it also actually provides these scrutineers with evidence that the count is being done right. But of course, not all ballots are counted this way anymore, not even in Australia. Oops. And we know a lot more involvement of computerized processes in both in the voting and the counting process. So the question is, how can we try to recover this idea of a publicly scrutinizable process, even though we use electronic systems a lot more in elections? Australia has no standards, no rules, nothing in this department. The United States has a document, the US government has produced a document called the Verifiable Voting System Guidelines, which in typical American style is a totally voluntary list of suggestions from the federal government, because wouldn't it be terrible if the federal government interfered in election conduct? But it's actually a very good document, and it says these 2 things. It says your election system has to be auditable and enable evidence-based elections. And then this core principle that it lays out is that an error or fault in the voting system software or hardware cannot cause an undetectable change in the election results. So this property is called software independence, and it was introduced by Rivest and Wack to characterize what it means for the voting system to be scrutinizable. And of course, that property doesn't necessarily imply the thing that was in the picture, right? Because we could also ask whether misbehavior by a specific person or the failure of a particular process could cause an undetectable change in the election result. But at least when we're talking about the software system itself, this idea of software independence seems to characterize what we want out of it. And the document then goes on to say there are two different ways that you can do this. One is through paper records that are verified by voters or verifiable by voters. And the other is cryptographic end-to-end verifiable voting systems. So most of this talk is going to be about the first option, but the next slide, just to make it clear what we're talking about, or what the two alternatives are, is end-to-end verifiable systems. Okay, who's in the IACR and who's voted in the Helios elections? Ron and Amin. Anybody else? No? Okay. So if you join the International Association of Cryptologic Research, you get to use a system that looks approximately like this. And the system is kind of beautiful in that it uses some very, very nice, very elegant kind of cryptographic properties to prove stuff about the election outcome being accurate. So we start off on the left, and each voter uses a machine that they don't necessarily trust to build a ciphertext that is supposed to encode their vote. Everybody's ciphertext then gets uploaded to a public notice board, and then there's some very nice kind of mathematical operations that will aggregate everybody's vote, add them all up, prove that they're properly decrypted and so forth. So everything, hang on, I'm going to do it with the mouse so that the people on the Zoom can see. Basically, everything to the right of about this part on the board is a very high integrity process with a very low undetectable failure probability. The reason that these kinds of systems are very tricky is that people are not able to generate their own ciphertext. It's the input that's the problem. And so all systems of approximately this kind have a step where the voter can try to challenge, you make your ciphertext on one machine that you don't trust, and then if you feel like being skeptical, you demand that the machine that made the ciphertext shows you the randomness that it used to generate the ciphertext, and then you take that randomness to another machine and you redo the calculation to check that it did the right thing. In principle, this gives you a very high degree of evidence, if you do it enough times, that the machine is behaving properly and that you had an opportunity to check if it misbehaved. In practice, people very rarely do it. So of the people who have voted in Helios elections, keep your hand up if you have actually challenged at least one ciphertext. Oh, you have. Good on you, I mean. Once. Very good. I also have challenged it once so that I can make the following, so that I could make this picture. This is kind of what you get if you challenge your Helios ciphertext. You get this nice little printout that exposes the large numbers used to make it. So there are beautiful things about these end-to-end verifiable cryptographic voting systems, but the input step is really hard. Hard enough that I think it's probably not a feasible way of really getting the evidence that we need at the moment with real people. But the casting and tallying steps are very rigorous and very convincing. Okay, which leaves us with the other route, the plain paper combined with auditing route. And again, that's not necessarily an easy route either. So we have the input step for most people is really easy. Not for everybody, but for most people. This is obviously an American set of instructions. Australian instructions are slightly more complicated, but it's still very intuitive to kind of fill in your piece of paper with a pencil. The process of verifying that your piece of paper made it properly into the tally is pretty hard, actually. And when we read the risk limiting audit literature, there's a really big assumption that all of the pieces of paper got properly into the count. That assumption is actually really hard to verify, especially when the count is conducted in a centralised kind of way, which it is in most of Australia. So this middle step is challenging. And you might have seen, even just in the last week, there have been some articles about arson and other forms of deliberate sabotage against American physical ballot boxes. So this part of the paper ballot process, kind of looking after the paper ballot between the point where the person fills it in and the point where it gets counted, is hard. And then finally, we want to ask, well, how can we check whether the count is accurate? And that's kind of what most of the talk is about, this kind of last phase of trying to audit and verify that the tally is accurate. And this, I've written workable under this slide because it does possibly take a significant amount of work, but it's doable, and it's doable in a way that provides public evidence of having got the right result. I think I'll pause there. Does anyone want to ask questions or offer opinions about these two? I mean, the thing that I think is a bit weird about this is you wouldn't automatically think that we only really kind of have two ways of doing this. And if you really wanted to save democracy, then what you would do is try and figure out a way of combining this kind of very, very simple intuitive voter input with the cryptographic style of highly highly convincing, very unlikely to fail kind of proof. But we kind of don't have that. So the election guard system combines both of these things, but it kind of runs them both in parallel rather than linking one up to the other. Yes, Monica. Yes. Yeah, so the question is about postal voting. And I guess I would put that into this hard, scary red box here, right? That you can fill it in fine, but then when you're putting it into the mail, or in the United States, putting it into a Dropbox or something, your ability to verify that it got into the count is pretty limited. All right. And we have had, there was someone convicted of fraud associated with postal voting in one of the northern suburbs of Melbourne within the last year or two. He'd just kind of gone along, he and his cronies had gone along and fished people's ballots out of the mailboxes and filled them in and sent them back. Yeah, and he should have gone to jail for a long time, but he got a slap on the wrist and a community service order. So I'm expecting that we'll see that kind of crime repeated, because why wouldn't you if you don't get punished? Anyway, on that cheerful note, so I'm about to describe a process that isn't perfect, but is the kind of best that I can think of. And probably, I think that in the context of all of the research in this area, probably the best that anyone has thought of in terms of combining the various different ways that you could think about getting input from people in a trustworthy way and gathering evidence that that input was accurately counted. So here's how it goes. Everybody votes on paper. And then there's some kind of electronic process for scanning the data off the pieces of paper and counting the votes electronically. And then after we've done that, we're going to run some kind of audit to check that the paper evidence accurately matches whatever we counted. So this is actually very common throughout the United States. It's also used in Australia for Senate elections, for Victorian Legislative Council elections, for a lot of New South Wales elections, and so forth. So that daggy picture that I showed from the ASA of people counting manually, that's sometimes the case, but actually a lot of Australian ballots are counted like this. So the key invention is called risk limiting audits, invented by Philip Stark and developed with a lot of his students and his colleagues. The idea is you start with a trustworthy record of paper ballots, and you use random sampling of the paper ballots to test the announced election result. So we're just checking that the right people won. We're not necessarily checking that the tally is precisely accurate, because that would require sampling the whole lot. So we want some degree of confidence that the outcome is right. So the security goal is the thing that's written at the bottom. We choose some kind of risk limit in advance. Sometimes it's specified in legislation, sometimes it's chosen by officials. In Colorado, it's 3%. But it's a parameter that you choose in advance that parameterizes the process. And then the guarantee is this: if the outcome is wrong, in other words, if the wrong people won, not just that the tallies are a little bit off, but that somebody wrong got elected or got announced as being elected, then the audit will not accept that result except with probability at most alpha. All right, so when I first started looking at this literature, it was all about American-style plurality elections. So the kind of election where you're just picking one or sometimes a few candidates, and the aggregation is very, very simple. We just add up how many people voted for Alice and how many people voted for Bob, and whoever gets the biggest tally wins. So the next couple of slides are about that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about other more complicated kinds of elections. Okay, so just to make the statistical claim a little bit more precise, we start off with a claim about the election result. Somebody tallied some pieces of paper and they claim that, you know, Alice got 40% of the vote and Bob got 31%. And we want to answer the question, did Alice actually really beat Bob? And the way that we do that is to sample and to test the null hypothesis, which is the opposite hypothesis, which is that Alice and Bob are actually tied. So sample a bunch of ballots at random. If you get to the point where the number of votes that you see for Alice is extremely unlikely if Alice and Bob are both tied, then you can be fairly confident that the hypothesis that Bob did at least as well as Alice is wrong. So the risk, I think I said this already, but this is just the summary. The risk is the maximum chance the audit fails to correct an apparent outcome that's actually wrong. And the risk limiting audit has a guaranteed minimum chance of making that kind of mistake. So if you already know what a p-value is, the measured risk is just the p-value of the null hypothesis, given the sampling that you're getting. Okay, so we can do things that are a little bit cleverer than this. So the thing I described on the previous slide was just kind of sampling to see whether you got more votes for Alice than you got for Bob. The next level of clever is if you have the kind of scanning system that actually gives you a record for each ballot, so that you don't necessarily just have to fish out of a great big pile of ballots. You start off with basically a big Excel file or a CSV file that says, ballot number 52 in batch 30 has the following votes on it. Then you can do the audit in a much more efficient way and look at comparing a specific record in the database with a specific piece of paper that you fished out. And then you're asking an equivalent but differently phrased question, which is the rate of overstatements in Alice's favour greater than or less than the extent to which it seems like Alice won? And it turns out for various reasons that you can then acquire the same level of confidence with a much smaller sample, assuming that the error rate is reasonably low. And in particular, if you kind of get a bunch of errors that overstate Alice and a bunch of other errors that kind of understate Alice, then they kind of come out in the wash and you can still be reasonably confident the outcome is right without doing a great deal of work. Okay, so just to summarize, this is what the flowchart looks like. The blue box is the audit statistics with the risk limit guarantee. At the beginning, you give it a list of apparent winners and a risk limit. And optionally, depending on what kind of audit you're doing, you give it a big database of records that are supposed to characterize what's on each individual ballot paper. And then it asks for a random sequence of sampled ballots. It does some calculations and it might say, yes, thank you, that sequence of sampled ballots convinces me that the election outcome is right. Or it might say, no, I need more samples, I'm not convinced yet. And you will have noticed that it's obviously possible to get stuck indefinitely in this orange cycle in the bottom. So you can at any time give up and count them all by hand. All right, any questions about that? Shall I go on to the next? All right. So can this process derive public evidence that it got the right answer? Or is this just something for electoral officials to do for themselves? And the answer is yes. You can set this up in such a way that it makes a public evidence trail, but you have to do the process carefully in order to make it convincing to the public. And in particular, you have to deal properly with a number of specific details that kind of feel like they come more from the crypto side, the crypto protocol side of the world than from the statistics side of the world. You have to make sure that the authorities commit properly to the cast vote records if we're using comparisons, or to the outcome if we're just polling the ballots. You have to make sure that the random number generation process that seeds the sampling process is unpredictable to whoever is trying to potentially trying to cheat. And you have to make sure that everybody can independently redo the risk calculations if they want. So there's definitely I can talk a little bit more about this at the end, but there's definitely some kind of protocol design style things here that we can ask about how to make sure that the transcript of this process is verifiable by independent parties. All right, so now I'm going to talk about, although probably not in very much detail. Oh, yes. Yes. Correct. It's a statistical yes with a correct, with a, or one way of looking at it. And so I showed this slide to a bunch of PhD students at another crypto group. And they said, one of them said, this is an interactive proof with a non-negligible soundness error. Right? So there's an authority, it commits to some things, it makes a claim, you get to challenge it. That's the, the dice rolling to generate the pseudorandom sequence. There's some real proof, like there's a complete proof associated with all the pieces of paper, but we're probably not going to examine all of them. We're probably just going to sample them. And then we agree that there's a small probability alpha that the proof will be accepted even if the claim is false. Yes. So there are several different implementations of this all over the place, and various different authorities that run this in one way or the other. And depending on exactly what assumptions you make about yes. Yeah, how scalable is it? So this is a very good question. And I guess that there's a couple of different things. One is how verifiable is it to the public? And the other is how much work do you have to do when you're doing the audit? Both of which have a lot of important details. So the amount of work that you have to do for the audit is very highly dependent on the margin. So it's not much work. You don't need very many samples if the margin is relatively large. And relatively large even means, 1% is actually relatively large and it doesn't take very many samples. But if the election is really close, then the sampling required goes like the inverse of the margin. Wow. So the question was, does it matter the style of voting? And the answer is yes, it kind of actually does for a few reasons. So I've been doing some work with the state of Colorado. American voting is very complicated. So yeah, so one person's ballot has a whole lot of different contests on it. And for example, there'll be some contests that cross across different county boundaries, like congressional districts and things like this. So now you're not just kind of asking one group of people to do the audit, you're kind of asking this group of people and that group of people and this other group of people to kind of participate collectively in the audit. So that's kind of item number one. And then the other thing is there are some contests, again, in the US where only a tiny number of people are eligible to participate. And it might be, 5% of voters in this county and 10% of voters in that county and another 6 voters in this county are all voting for the same school board that happens to be in the overlapping blob. And that kind of stuff actually gets very complicated. Well, it makes all of these kinds of, in principle, it doesn't make any difference to the kind of beautiful public verifiability properties. But in practice, if you want to audit a contest where you've got a great big pile of ballots and only 5% of them have a particular contest, then it's actually a real pain to kind of figure out how to, do we do a special kind of sampling where we look for just that contest? Do we sample all of them, but 20 times as many just so that we get the number that we need for that contest? What about all the other contests on the same piece of paper? So a lot of these kinds of details actually end up making a mess and making the whole thing a lot more complicated than it seems to be. Most of which is fortunately not my job. Do you have more questions? No, anyone else? No. Okay. So that is also a good question. The question was, is this kind of evidence published? And the answer is yes, mostly. However, there are complexities around it, both in Australia and in the US. For example, in Colorado, they will remove, because different people are eligible to vote on very specific different things, sometimes you are identifiable just because of the collection of contests you are eligible to vote on. And in those instances, or instances where that set of people is very small, they will not publish the vote record in advance for reasons that are pretty clear. And so that then introduces a not quite perfectness into the opportunity for other people to verify it in advance. So people have suggested things like making a hiding commitment to the thing instead of publishing it in plain text and things like that. But apart from things like that, the Victorian Electoral Commission also refuses to publish ballots, incidentally, because they're concerned that the preference listing might be identifiable. So that gets in the way a little bit. Yes. So that's a good question. Has this actually ever been used? I sincerely doubt it. I've never heard of people actually intimidating voters as a consequence of data that was published online for this. But I understand why some people think it might be a concern in principle. Yeah. And you wouldn't necessarily know either. If it was used to intimidate people, you wouldn't necessarily know. So it does kind of make some sense. Although, especially in the Victorian case, I think the transparency argument is stronger. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, I think the VEC gets it wrong because you can't even double check that they counted right. In practice in Colorado, they really have to redact very many, and it usually doesn't make much difference to the outcome. So it seems harder to argue that that's a bad choice. But then again, you could use some fancy crypto to make it even more transparent. So anyway, so the answer to this bullet point at the bottom is, in principle, you could, I think, make this a totally transparent, publicly verifiable process, although obviously somebody still has to actually look at the pieces of paper. But assuming that something trustworthy happens with the actual sampling of with the actually looking at what's on the piece of paper, I think the transcript can be publicly verifiable, but in practice, there are a lot of little details that make a big difference to whether people are willing to do it or not. Okay. So when I came to this topic, it was all about American style elections, and the instant runoff voting was an open question. And so Michelle Blom and Peter Stuckey and I worked for years on trying to understand instant runoff voting and trying to understand how we could fit Australian style preferential elections into this framework where you can have a genuine risk limiting audit. So everybody probably knows what instant runoff voting is, but just in case you haven't voted in an Australian election, the Australian ballot paper looks like this. You are, at least in this example, for the purpose of, for now, we're just electing one person, but we're electing one person by expressing a whole list of preferences on all of the candidates. So 1 is your highest preference and 8 is the person you like the least in this example. And the algorithm goes like this. And they literally, spread ballots out on a table, at least they used to at some stage. So think of that picture from the AEC at the beginning. So they start off looking at each ballot according to its first preference, and then they sort them with one pile for each candidate. And if somebody has got a majority, that person wins and we're done. If there's nobody with an absolute majority, we take the candidate with the smallest tally, we kind of pick up their ballots, we remove that candidate completely from the running, and then we look at each ballot and see who the next uneliminated candidate is, and we kind of put that piece of paper onto whoever's pile is the next preference. So eventually you get to the point where somebody's got more than half of the remaining votes, and then you're done. And in fact, yeah, you can think of it as running all the way until you've only got one candidate left, or you can think of it as stopping whenever you've got a strict majority, and either way you get the same answer. So it's not obvious how to run a risk limiting audit on this system. So here's the first thing we could try. We could literally just audit every elimination step. So we get a certain outcome that seems to be right. We say, first we eliminated Chuan, then we eliminated Bob, then Ellis was left, and we could test each of those steps with a risk limiting audit. That would be sound, but we'd waste a whole lot of time verifying comparisons that actually didn't make any difference. And in fact, it's quite common that there's a large number of candidates with very low tallies at the beginning, and the differences between them are small, but it doesn't really matter because they all get eliminated and it doesn't really matter what order they get eliminated in. So we need to check whether it matters, but most of the time it doesn't. So here's the second try is, and this was actually the first thing that Michelle Blom and Peter Stuckey and I did, which was we designed an algorithm to compute the margin, which is the smallest number of ballots that you need to change in order to change the outcome. And then you can do an audit with comparisons in which you check for the total number of discrepancies between a ballot paper and its corresponding cast vote record. And if you can convince yourself that the number of errors is less than the margin, then the outcome must be right. The thing that's, and this is again sound, but again, you might be wasting a significant amount of effort because it might be that a lot of the errors you observe don't actually make any difference. If you observe an error that doesn't actually advantage the winner or doesn't even really change the order in which things happened, you don't need to worry about it. So the final step is, I guess, our main contribution is an algorithm for auditing the complete, sorry, let me start that again. An algorithm for analysing the complete set of cast vote records and generating a set of assertions that's sufficient to imply the announced election result, but nevertheless easy to audit, or as easy as it can be to audit. So the assertions might say things like, if Alice and Bob and Joanne are the only people left, then Bob does not get eliminated next. Or there's never a situation in which Alice has fewer votes than Bob. And so the algorithm uses a branch and bound algorithm to generate a sufficient set of assertions to imply that the announced winner won. And then we go and audit each of them with an RLA. So now the process looks like this. We give the assertion generator the cast vote records and the risk limit and the apparent winners. And then the assertions get sent to the RLA algorithm, and then we do the RLA to test each assertion. There are a whole lot of slides about the details about how the algorithm works, but I think I'm going to skip them unless you really care about instant runoff voting. Just kind of know that they exist, and if you want to ask about it, you can. But I think we'll leave it out. There's a whole lot of code that people are welcome to go and look at that explains how it works. So again, you don't have to trust the assertion generation algorithm. You can verify the assertions or regenerate them yourself or check that they're sufficient without even necessarily needing to understand how they were generated. All right, so the next question is this real? It has been run in practice. It's been run in San Francisco and in most recently in Boulder, Colorado for their mayoral contest. So here are some pictures from the audit in San Francisco. The two people at the front are electoral officials running the audit, and the people at the back are local citizens who felt like showing up and looking. And again, the obvious question is, well, did they really get evidence that it was run properly? And the answer is, they certainly got to see the ballot papers. I'm not sure they were present when the random seed was generated, because I think that was done on an earlier day. It was just a pilot. But in principle, there was enough information for them to confirm the results. I don't know whether they actually did or not. So this pilot ran only on a subset, which the vote by mail votes, because we were just kind of testing whether it worked or not. But in principle, there's enough information available that people can verify the computations. More pictures from San Francisco. We are in the process of finishing an extension to Colorado's risk limiting audit system to incorporate IRV, which is all of the same ideas that I've discussed in this work integrated into their pre-existing risk limiting audit software. And you can go and see the code for that online if you're interested. It could be used in Australia if we could persuade the Australian authorities to have anything other than perfect faith in their existing counting methods. As far as I know, there is no plan to use it in Australia, but in principle it could be. All right, so that's the end of that topic. The next topic is European style elections. Does anyone want to ask about IRV before I move on to the next thing? Yes.
One thing I'm interested to know is all these assessment. Are you able to say information theoretically there will be enough assertions that they can mathematically verify, like aside from the public verifying?
So this is a good question. So the question is, so your algorithm generates a bunch of assertions. How do you know that that set of assertions really is sufficient to imply the announced winner? Is that a good way of yes. So this is a good question. If I give you a set of assertions, how would you actually verify that they are sound? In other words, that they really are sufficient to imply that the announced winner won. And so, okay, since you asked, let's describe, so there's two different kinds of assertions. So one says, one looks at one very specific step of the IRV elimination process and says, if this set of candidates are still standing, and are the only set of candidates who are still standing, then this person beats that person. So that's the not eliminated next assertion. And then the other assertion is much more general and applies in any context and says, this person's first preferences are greater than the total number of mentions of this loser that are not preceded by the winner. So there's no circumstance in which L could ever be higher than W. So now, armed with those two logical statements, never mind whether they're true or not, but let's just think about whether a collection of them is sufficient. This is just one example of three statements and an argument about why they are sufficient. So in each assertion excludes a certain set of elimination sequences. Some assertions exclude lots of elimination sequences, others will only kind of cut the tree at one particular point. So now the verification problem that you describe becomes a statement about, really a statement about tree pruning. So each one of these trees is rooted at a particular winner. So let's say this one, for example, is rooted, this one is the tree of different ways in which Bob can win. And each branch is an elimination order. So this is the order in which Diego gets eliminated first, then Chuan, then Ellis, leaving Bob as the last person. So the question is, do we have an assertion that tells us that this branch is, do we have an assertion which, if it was true, would preclude this branch from happening? And so in this example, we've got the not eliminated next assertion, which says that when Ellis and Bob are the last two people standing, Ellis has a greater tally than Bob. So that proves that this branch and that branch are not possible. Assume correct. So now the verification question that you ask becomes the question, is it the case that for each tree with a winner who isn't the announced winner, we pruned every branch with at least one assertion? So thinking about an efficient way to prove that it's true is a bit hard, but at least you can think of a dumb, exhaustive search over all possible elimination orders to check. Oh, sorry, that's my 45-minute time. You can think of an exhaustive search over all possible trees and checking that there's something precluding it. Yes, so this is also a good question, which is why Peter Stuckey and Michelle Blom got involved. So the question was, what's the complexity of the algorithm for generating these assertions? And the answer is, in the worst case, it's factorial, right? Because in the worst case, you have to go down to all of the leaves, and there are n factorial of them. But in practice, because Michelle and Peter are clever, in practice, it seems to give us efficient results in all real circumstances. And the reason really is that real voting patterns are very structured and have kind of predictable patterns. And the clever branch and bound algorithm that Michelle and Peter mostly thought of, with a little bit of help from me, is good at not exploring all the way down and just kind of pruning when we've got something good enough and moving on. So in practice, it seems to run fine, even for very large elections where the number of candidates is the important thing. Doesn't matter that much how many votes there are, but even when the number of candidates is quite large, it seems to run okay in practice on real votes. But you can definitely invent bad test cases that cause it to be bad. So it's definitely O of n factorial. You have the worst case complexity. Am I claiming that it's O of n? I don't know what I would claim about the kind of in practice case. Yes.
Have you implemented 8 different original algorithms to check all the margin with the original algorithm and compare it with the time it takes?
Oh, that's an interesting question. No, we haven't. So, so what we have done is downloaded a bunch of data from all of the places all over the world that run IRV elections and just kind of run our thing on the voting data to see whether it returns in a reasonable time, which it seems to do. Yeah. So what's the second thing? Yeah. Yeah. The question is, how do you deal with donkey votes? And the answer is tough. It's a vote. You just have to take it as it is. Absolutely. People vote like this in an election, which they often do. It just counts. Like, there's no notion of chucking it out because it looks a bit sus. Oh, that's also a good question. So that's a slightly different thing. What about invalid votes? What if the person, maybe they skip a number or they repeat a number? Yeah. And the answer is that's very jurisdiction dependent. So Victoria has a set of rules, Colorado has a set of rules, federal elections have a set of rules, and they'll take a not quite right set of preferences and they'll say, well, the appropriate interpretation of that not quite right ballot is the following according to the following rules. And so then the valid interpretation becomes the input to our algorithm. So we don't necessarily care exactly what the person wrote, we care what the appropriate interpretation as a valid set of preferences is. Which in Australia is often nothing, by the way. They can be pretty, you don't have to make very many mistakes before your Australian ballot is not counted, whereas Colorado is a lot more generous and kind of the rules are a lot more. They'll still include the first few understandable preferences, even if it's messed up afterwards, yes. More commonly, again, there's 9 different sets of rules in Australia, but more commonly, you have to get more of it right in order to get it counted. Yeah. Actually, there's more than 9 different sets of rules because there's one set of rules for the upper house and a different set of rules for the lower house. I just realized that I've stuffed up my timer, but how much time do I have left? 10 minutes. Okay, cool. Okay, so that's IRV audits. And obviously I could talk about that all day, and anybody who's really interested, come and talk to me afterwards and we can persuade the Australian authorities to do it. I just want to end in the last few minutes with a couple of mentions of there's heaps of other electoral systems all over the world, right? So RLAs started in America. American voting is almost always plurality. We extended it to IRV. I have some colleagues in Belgium who are interested in the European style proportional representation systems. And it turns out that it's almost the dual of IRV. So this is the way that Belgian parliamentary elections are conducted, and something similar happens in a lot of other European democracies. So people are presented with a series of parties, and each party has a list of candidates, and then you basically choose one party. Although you can fiddle the candidates a little bit, but we'll ignore that for now. And then the initial count is very simple and is represented by this first row here. We just count how many votes each party got. And the intention is approximately each party is going to get seats in the parliament in proportion to what fraction of the vote they got. But of course, we have a problem because it's unlikely that they all work out as a nice integer number of seats. So then there's this slightly more complicated process to deal with the fact that the fractions are not a nice integer number of seats. And in the d'Hondt system, it goes like this. We have a list of quotients, which fortunately are 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we divide each tally by those successive quotients. And in this example, we're giving away 6 seats, but we just pick, if we're giving away S seats, we just pick the S largest numbers in the table. And if a party has 2 of the largest numbers, then they get 2 seats and so forth. So algorithm is very, very simple, or at least much more simple than IRV. And actually, if you think about auditing it for a minute, the audit, the set of assertions, if you like, is actually also really simple, because all you have to prove, or you have to test rather, is that everybody who looks like a winner in one party beats everybody who looks like a loser in every other party. And in fact, you only need to test the lowest winners against the highest losers, and then you're done. So it's super easy to generate the assertions. Belgium has an extra rule that a party has to get above a certain threshold. There are various other kinds of funny rules in other democracies, but generating the assertions is really easy. The thing that's hard is that it turns out in practice the margins are incredibly small. And I'm not quite sure why, but they really are very, very small. And so we're trying to think about whether we can relax the statement a little bit and talk about maybe looking at testing the winning coalitions instead of testing whether individual parties got exactly the number of seats that it looks like they got. All right, so does anyone come from a country where this kind of system is used? No? Okay, in that case, we could probably leave it there. So future work. So here are the open problems in the auditing space. I talked about the single winner case of preferential voting. You probably know that in the Australian Senate and in the upper houses of a lot of the state parliaments, we have a multi-winner version called the single transferable vote. We cannot figure out how to audit this at all. It's very hard. We have a series of papers kind of gradually expanding the set of cases that we can cover, but it's still just very, very difficult to understand. I'd also like to think more about this notion of the protocol and the public verifiability of the protocol and the idea of kind of modeling it as an interactive proof and kind of thinking about how to make it rigorous and verifiable. And then the third bullet point is probably the hardest. And usually when I give this talk, somebody puts up their hand and says, well, you know, why would you expect anybody to trust this? Oh, it's complicated maths and statistics and stuff. This is not going to solve the problem that you started with, which is possibly true, but this is the best I could do. All right, I think I'm going to end there and see if people have any more questions. Mm.
And to give an example that I've given, what happened that they got medical, like, so they trusted the network, they explained it to the way and they visualized it. At the same time that was happening, they're also telling them to use math.
To use what, sorry? I remember the app vividly.
There, tell the public as a kind of use this because it's something. And then tell the part before anyone needs to do it. I think that's part of where the, you know, people are very good at spinning elections, but the other way around is very good at spinning. And there's various ways to do that. So that might be your next step. How do you create a narrative that is believable, that's explainable for the general public as well, and who tells that story?
Yeah. Yeah, this is hard. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, it's a weird electoral system if you haven't seen it before. So the concept is, forget about individual candidates. We're just thinking about allocating seats to parties. So each party is going to collect a certain number of votes and they're going to get a certain number of seats. So this table is deciding how many seats each party gets. And the first row is just their raw tally. So this says party 1 got 10,000 votes, party 2 got 6,000 votes, party 3 got 4,000 votes. In this example, we're handing out 6 seats. And the algorithm is the following. You take each tally and you divide it by each of these successive divisors. So, you know, 1, a half, a third, a quarter, etc. Actually, maybe I'll go back. I'll go back one slide. And, you know, potentially this keeps going down a fifth, the sixth, the seventh and eighth, etc., depending on how many seats you've got. And so the algorithm is, if we're giving away S seats, we divide each tally by all of these succession of divisors, and then we look at the whole table and we find the S largest numbers and, you know, put a circle around them or color them blue, as the case may be. And that determines how many seats each party gets. So if you've got 3 of the largest numbers, you get 3 seats. And if you've got 2 of the largest numbers, you get 2 seats and so forth. So the arithmetic is actually a little bit weird, and it took me a long time to understand why this is doing the right thing. But what it actually achieves is a pretty good approximation to proportional representation. And I guess if you think about it, imagine that they did all work out to be a perfect integer multiple of a right fraction of the seats. I don't know, suppose there were 10 seats, let's say, and 10,000 votes, and the threshold was 1,000, then you would, by this process, actually get exactly the right kind of integer fraction of seats. And it's not obvious why it works, but it does work. And the thing that's tricky about it is, obviously, you don't usually get nice integer multiples. So you kind of have to decide, for this party that got 2,400 votes, they kind of fit in between, you know, half of this party and a third of this party, and they miss out, whereas the other person gets rounded up. Sorry, it wasn't the best possible explanation, was it? But anyway, this is the algorithm, and that's what it does. It's wrong. Yes. What about... Yes, that's a good question. How is seeding the randomness done in practice? And the answer is, I'm actually not quite sure what they did in San Francisco for the pilot. In Colorado, they literally they have a specific day, and they put a little ad in the newspaper saying, we're going to be rolling the dice on such and such a day. And before COVID, people could actually come in actively, and kind of citizens could help toss the dice as well. I think that's stopped during COVID. I'm not quite sure what the current situation is. And now they show a video of that. I'm not 100% sure what they're doing this year. But this picture, this picture is Ron and Philip, you know, tossing their dice, reading off the dice, and then entering them into the PRNG seed on their laptops. Correct. So this is, and again, you actually have to think carefully about when this has to happen, but this has to happen after the authorities have made some kind of binding commitment to the cast vote records and the outcome. So they make some kind of binding commitment, then we have to have some kind of trustworthy, random, really random seed generation process, and then this seed goes into a pseudorandom algorithm for generating the ballot samples that is supposed to be already determined. But yeah, that matters. Oh, it has the D'Hondt system as well, or something very similar. Yes. Yeah. With something a little bit extra complicated to do with adding people who get something else, right? I think I did actually look at Germany at one point and decided it was hideously complicated, because it's the D'Hondt thing plus some extras, right? But anyway, anytime anybody wants to audit German elections. We did actually do a little bit of work with a postdoc at the time called Yuri Budurshi, who was looking at auditing German local council elections, and just working through what the assertions had to be for them. For the German elections, yeah. So we do actually have a paper with a postdoctoral researcher who was working in Germany at the time about German local government elections. And we looked at it in practice and decided that it's actually quite feasible to audit which parties got how many seats. You know, the number of ballots you have to go and sample is relatively reasonable. But German voters are also able to express opinions about individual candidates within each parties and kind of bump a candidate up if they want to. And that ended up having tiny margins. So within one party, for example, here, if party one got 3 seats, it might be that the boundary between their 3rd candidate and their 4th candidate is really tiny. So those margins were really small. Yes. Oh, that's an interesting question. So the question was, the Australian electoral authorities are quite resistant to this. Why aren't, you know, did you get any resistance from San Francisco and Colorado? And if not, why not? And the answer is, I mean, not at all, right? They wanted to do it. Now, how they came to the point where they wanted to do it, I'm not 100% sure. That was sort of before I showed up. In the case, I'm pretty sure that both places, certainly Colorado did, and I think San Francisco did too, have risk limiting audits long before they had instant runoff voting. So they already had all the processes in place and the idea that the audit was a good thing for confirming the outcome. And then they wanted to extend it to instant runoff voting. So that's a very different pathway to the Australian pathway, which is at the moment mostly to completely trust the technology. So there is a recent federal law mandating an audit of the Senate ballots, which is recent as of sort of just before the most recent federal election, which is a good law. The AEC doesn't really see why they need to do it. Right? As far as they're concerned, the software is perfectly trustworthy. They don't see that auditing the paper ballots adds to the process at all. Ha ha ha. So the question was, is the Senate ballot counting software open to be audited? The answer is ha ha ha. No, it's not. But it's perfectly trustworthy. It's absolutely fine. So there was a bit of a campaign to try to make it openly available to public scrutiny many years ago. The campaign failed. And I guess my argument is, well, okay, actually auditing the actual outcome in terms of checking the ballot papers against the against the digitized preferences is actually a better direct check of whether or not the software did the right thing than analyzing the software. Of course, it would be better if the software was openly available, but given that that's not happening, a genuine audit process is actually better, because we could spend a lot of time analysing a software system, but it doesn't necessarily prove that that was what ran on the day. So that would have been good, but it's not happening. The audit process is better. If I could have some influence on the AEC, there are things I would do to improve the audit process. So the legislation doesn't explicitly say that they have to sample randomly. It should. It was just a kind of accidental omission. So they do their audit by, or at least last time they did their audit, by just kind of taking the first packet that came in on the pallet from the truck or whatever, and I'm like, well, that's kind of random. And I said, no, that's kind of not random. That's not random. So that kind of thing needs to be improved. The other thing that needs to be improved is there are slightly different ideas of what constitutes the matching digital record. And there's one idea that works, right, which is they eventually, at the end of the process, they publish online a complete list of ballots, and you can double check the count, which is actually really cool. It's great. You can double check the Senate count and make sure that they didn't mess it up. But that's the data that they should use for the audit. And I think last time when they did the audit, they used some sort of earlier representation of that data out of the database. So they're kind of missing a step of making sure that the data they did the audit against is the same data that we can all double check the count of. So that law is still a lot better than any other auditing laws we have anywhere on the continent, which is nowhere. But it's nowhere near as good as the process that Colorado or San Francisco run, for example. Thanks, everyone.